What's up, Power Painters? This is Taylor Payton of TayPayArt.com and PowerPainters.org coming to you today with another Power Painters tutorial. So in this tutorial, we're going to be continuing the drawing process. So this is part 2 of this little series I'm doing, where I showcase a real-time process of taking something from, a very nebulous, hazy, not very clear idea into something that's more manifest, something that has more weight using fundamental artistic principles. So hopefully you watched the first part and we're able to glean some good things from that, because now we're moving on to the next part where I will be actually doing some value separation, some tone. So values are basically how bright or dark something is, to simplify it quite a bit. There is a lot more I go into regarding values in my beginner drawing course as well as my beginner painting course. But for the sake of this video, all you really need to understand is that you need to separate objects by value so that you can begin to carve out a sort of hierarchy of brightness and darkness. So if I go really dark in the background, I can probably leave him a lot lighter, for example. Or if I make him very dark, it's a good idea to have some contrast by having a lighter background. So when we're separating things based on local values, that means the value that it is assigned without any sort of light interacting with it. Light will raise the value, obviously, as light makes things brighter. And shadow, where light is absent, is going to allow things to fall into darkness. And so we're going to use values and light in order to start carving form. But in order to do that, we first need to figure out our light source, and then we can start separating things by values and working based on the light sources we've established. So I think I'm going to go with a pretty direct light source. Let's just do something kind of interesting where we'll go with kind of a back rim light on him, on the robot figure, which is pretty masculine. And then we got this like small 4 scale girl figure. So I'm going to go with a light source that's going to be sort of top down. It could be like the sun's almost directly above them. I think that that would be a pretty easy thing to configure and to imagine. So we're going to go with that. And then we'll just have a little bit of rim light creeping up the back to help separate things. And maybe they're in like a hangar or something, like a place where you would keep your giant robot before you go and take it to do stuff that a giant robot would do. I don't know, go grocery shopping or something. But I'm going to start by adding a background value, and I'm going to keep it really dark because that's just going to make it easier to carve form and to pull things forward. If you start with very light form, you may have some difficulty, as it is typically easier to pull things forward using light than it is to push them back using or starting from white. So we're just going to remember that our light source is top down, and I'm going to just keep priming the background here. And this process can take a little bit, but it's definitely worth it because we want to have that separation right off the bat so we know what we're working with, and the background value is more or less established from the get-go. All right. So if I do any little jumps or skips, it's probably just because I'm doing something very monotonous and it's not super important to the process for you to actually see it happen, like filling in a big blank area. All right, so that's pretty much it. We've got a nice dark background. It's a very dark hangar therein with some sort of top light, presumably, that's going to be coming down and casting maybe a sort of, I don't know, fluorescent-ish light, I guess would be a good way to put it. So we'll start with that. Since we need to figure out a local value for the figures first, though. So for the local value, I'm going to make the robot sort of a gray, and we'll leave her to be sort of lighter, brighter, whiter, because that will read like a nice little pop of bright value near the rule of thirds. I can just go ahead and extend that just a bit so we have more of that rule of thirds going on. If you haven't seen my video on this channel relating to composition, why you should plan your illustrations, I think it's called, that will give you some insight into the rule of thirds. It's a very simple compositional rule where our eye likes to rest at certain points on the picture plane, and it's basically dividing it, and the points where it intersects, well, our eye will rest. So that's one thing to consider while you're creating your ideas and getting your base composition down. So since our background's fairly dark, I have a lot of wiggle room in the upper end of this value spectrum here. And I'm going to start laying in some tone. Just going to paint. I'm going to paint with a multiply layer, so it's going to show through the lines. Multiply basically darken stuff. It's a very good for adding shadows or for making things have lower values without compromising some of the line work. So I'm just picturing where the light would be hitting the strongest and where it would be almost completely absent, and also taking into account the local value of the mech itself, which would be at least relatively dark as we've established. Not as dark as the background because we need something to pull forward and have that contrast, but still dark enough to give us some room to play with form. Try and keep the fringes, like I said, fairly light or bright for that rim light idea. You see rim light or other kinds of lighting that have really stark contrast, which means a big jump from values. A lot of really brights and really darks next to one another in film and TV because it's good for dramatic purposes. Whenever you're shading something, you have to consider how the form is turning. If the form is turning quickly, the shading will change quickly. If the form is turning slowly, then it's going to be more gradual. For example, the head here, it's probably going to have a more gradual fall off up here. So it's going to be brighter at the top, and it's going to be sort of spherical, like you imagine how light would hit a sphere versus how light hits a cube. Obviously, the faces of the cube are going to have much more stark contrast. Get rid of some, that's a little too dark of a value. We're going to get rid of some of the white. And just keep thinking in terms of how the light is affecting the forms. Then we can start separating things by, brighter or darker later. I mean the smaller shapes by brighter or darker, not the big shapes I'm separating right now. Usually we work our way from larger to smaller, so it's not a really basic value separation. We have, a very dark background with no real detail, just sort of blocked in. We have our mech at a darker value than the female figure, who is the lightest value. And that, if I squint, or if you're squinting at the screen, you can see that this is having a good amount of contrast here. I think we can probably push some of his stuff even more so since he takes up a lot of real estate. So I'm going to go back up to the multiply layer and start deepening the values even more based on that overhead light source we established earlier. Because there would definitely be some pockets, some occlusions, if you will, that would not be catching very much light at all. It's a very nice gradual plane, so get some fall off going there. I've also got reference up on my other monitor as per usual, just so I have something in case I get a little bit lost that I can refer to. This is basically the second aspect of shading once we've established a local value and a light source. So we're going with some shadow action now. You see I'm like cutting into the form, separating it as though it were clay, imagining I'm sculpting. And everything is still in a very rough state, but that's all right. We can always clean this up later using more opaque painting methods. But for now, we really just want to handle one thing at a time because that's parsing complexity. That's what makes the drawing process. And this is just, like I said, one way of working. There are so many ways you can dig into the craft and so many different types of processes you can use to bring a piece to fruition or completion. And they each have their ups and their downs, their positives and their negatives. It really is up to you to find working methods that work best for you in terms of results, in terms of something you feel an affinity for. You might use a certain working method if you want to kind of pull out particular aspects of your style. It just means that you are going to have to do some trial and error type things in order to fully have a better comprehension of what's going to work for you versus what isn't. So the main point still stands, though, that you definitely want to take things in a step-by-step fashion in a lot of ways, especially when you're just starting. Solve one problem at a time without creating new ones is kind of the hope in that capacity. And right now I'm just solving the shadow problem, the value problem. And problem, I mean, it's not always a problem, quote unquote. It's like a step or a phase, whatever you want to call it. It still pertains to the process. So, because, I mean, there are tons of issues in this. It's just that I can fix them as I go along, and some of them aren't as pressing as others. You can stop at any time so long as the mistakes are small enough or there are very little to no mistakes. So I suppose that kind of establishes the point. Got sort of that top-down light source. It's going to sell a lot better visually if I start painting opaquely as opposed to using that multiply blend mode. In the future, I will be doing a video on what each blend mode does in Photoshop or in other programs. I'll be painting in Photoshop, obviously, but the blend modes are, I think they're pretty universal across all or most platforms, most painting or drawing software that has stuff like multiply, overlay, etc. So I'll cover that at some point because it's really useful to know what those can do for your image making. I'm going to make these either super bright or super dark. I haven't quite decided yet. Super bright might be interesting because then I can get some glow going and separate her a little more so. Give her that frontal light. And I kind of like the way it reads in the thumbnail, so that's just a little test. I'm going to try making it super dark. So basically I'm assigning a value to those shapes and seeing how that is going to turn out. And dark is very interesting too. Kind of reminds me of Gundam a little bit. The Zaku, if you ever watch that anime. Or any like variant of it, because there's a ton of different Gundam series. Dark I'm not as big of a fan of though. Not in this case, simply because our background's already dark. So we're going to go with light when we use a value for these three kind of chevron arrow visor shapes. So we'll start with that. And hopefully this won't run too long. If it does, I'll just make a part 3 and wrap it up then. But what I'm hoping to do is just, like I said, take you through a process, give you something you can use in your own work, and also implement a little bit of fundamental talk at the same time so that you have an idea of how to start thinking like an artist, how to start parsing your images and your process in a way that is more valid and useful to you, as opposed to kind of winging it a little harder. Because we all wing it to some degree, really. It's just knowing the fundamentals and the principles that allow you to kind of rest upon them as you work. All right, they're looking a little too thin. I'm going to thicken those shapes out a bit. Because arguably they're kind of a focal point. I mean, it's the face. It's the robot face. So you got to have a good robot face. And if I don't like the face, I'll just repaint it. After a certain point, I will just destroy something if it's not working. I will paint over it and repaint it because that is one of the most surefire ways not only to practice getting rid of something that isn't working, but to challenge yourself to create a new iteration that behaves. I mean, not behaves because it's not like we're writing AI here, but visually has more of what you're looking for. So the cleanup phase is just painting opaquely, getting rid of some of those unnecessary lines. I'm keeping them as long as I can. I'm just making marks up and down the surface, following sort of the shadow that I have established earlier. And if I can get a lot of good form in the head, I can follow that general shape as I'm rendering the rest of the body. And in this dark lighting scenario, I highly doubt we'd be seeing much of anything underneath the chin or the neck region. So I can definitely push some of that back, carve into some of those shapes, and simplify. Simplifying is usually a fairly good bet when it comes to finishing up an image. There's a lot of superfluous stuff we make in the planning process, and if we're just going to be painting over our plans or our sketches, then you may have to simplify quite a bit. At least in a process like this where I had a really loose sketch. So it's just part of the game, part of what you would sort of accept as you move forward. So this is the top plane. It would be catching that aforementioned light that is coming from the top of the scene here, so somewhere up here. I wish that there was a function that allowed you to draw outside of the canvas, but I know that you could actually just create a bigger canvas and have a little square within that. But I think it'd be kind of convenient to be able to draw outside of it. But I don't know how that would work or if there's a plugin for that in Photoshop. Anyway, just kind of really giving this area some focus, really feeling it out in terms of the value structure and the shapes therein, simplifying things. Getting a little bright here, a little too hot because this plane isn't directly being lit, so it wouldn't have that kind of same bright value as this top plane right here. So planes are what we use in order to kind of calculate or estimate how light is falling across form. As I stated earlier, the faster the transition, the sharper the value will dive or change. And the smoother the transition, the more you get that graduation, that gradient effect. All right. One way to make your images look more readable immediately is just to clean up the edges. So this is the contour of everything. And to get rid of any sort of additional sketchiness that needn't be there, that isn't actually contributing, isn't actually adding detail. And I think I'm actually going to go in and paint over the face. It's just not doing it for me. So watch me simplify this whole area. Just decimate it. I get like, sometimes I get a little bit of a twisted pleasure out of it. Like, oh, yeah, just destroy it. Let it all go. Because we're going to do something better. And then back to my basic shape. Just a nice blank plane I get to work with and calculate a new design for. I can maybe take some of this stuff forward. A lot of my design sense comes from subdivision, which means taking larger shapes and breaking them up into smaller ones with lines. It's just something I notice about my own process. I think that a lot of artists do it in their own way, and sometimes you got to play with it a little bit, but I find it's something that comes pretty naturally to me, especially with mechanical things. I wonder if I can get some eyes in here. Oh gosh, oh no, it's going to be Full Metal Alchemist. We can't have that. As awesome as that would be, like I just cannot rip it. If I see something, you ever do that thing where you're drawing, where if you see your you're turning it into something that you've already seen, and you're like, oh no no no, that's way too close. I have to switch it up. I get the same thing in music where I'm like, no, that's pretty much the exact same chord structure and strum pattern of, X band, and I can't just rip it off like that. I got to change it up somewhat. Kind of cool to have like a skull face, maybe. I don't know. This is the fun part about design, or after you simplify, is you can just play with a ton of options. I don't want to play around too much because then we never get the video finished. But after a point, it becomes fun. So, but you gotta commit after a point. So I suppose we'll go with maybe a. I ended up going with dark eyes anyway, at least in this design. We'll go with sort of a multi, almost arachnid like breakup of shape. Oh, that's kind of cool. I'm feeling it, Mr. Krabs. If I seem a little less like, what's the word I'm looking for? A little less, I don't know, uptight. It's been a long day, and I almost forgot I had to do a video. I was working on freelance all day, and so I'm just kind of letting loose and having fun. This is personal work as far as I'm concerned. So I'm just gonna treat it like that. But we're still learning things, right? I hope so, and making it at least slightly entertaining. Because sometimes it's hard to watch a really long painting video. Like I'll go on YouTube and I'll see other artists, and they're amazing artists and they're painting, and I'm like, oh my god, I can learn so much. But then after like 15 minutes, I'm like, I just want to paint. Watching the painting is really hard when I could be painting. So sometimes I have to go back and watch it in multiple chunks. I mean, we're all usually pretty distracted nowadays, but that's neither here nor there. I'm going to get rid of some of this goofiness because as I'm chatting too much, I'm totally just noodling, making moves that have no actual bearing upon finishing something in the right way, and just sort of arbitrarily changing without actually making better. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm really solving this head. I'm putting some good time into it. I'm going to change the background color so I have a better point of contrast too. I feel like once I can solve the breakup of shape in regards to the the head, then we will be able to move on much quicker. Keep getting a face I don't want. Mm, yeah, too many lines. Too abstract. I feel like there's just one or two more shapes I need to make this work. But it keeps turning into a mouth, or looking like a mouth, which hasn't been working for me so far visually. A lot of it is intuitive, the design. Sometimes you got to come back and look at another area for a while. All right. Yeah, I just checked. It's been about 23 minutes already. So we're gonna just keep trucking here without rushing too much. I'm gonna add another layer for a stronger shadow separation. I'm trying to figure out how much I want to push it and how quickly in terms of the value structure. How much can I lose? What's important for the painting? Can I finish it in the time that I've already allotted? And right now it looks like the answer is going to be no. I mean, it is super sketchy, but sometimes for demo purposes, you gotta run with that. As you're just giving, unless I have multiple days at a workshop or something, I just accept the fact that I'm not going to be doing my best work on a demo while I'm talking and I'm not in my comfort zone as far as creating art goes. It's kind of interesting. I don't hate that. The smaller shapes, some of the smaller dots. Yeah, I can live with that. Turn this into a visor? Question mark? Not bad. Yeah, it's got a bigger, more interesting shape. Although I'm going to have to wrap the contour a little bit because it just gets really flat in that area. Contour referring to the outer edge of something. In this case, the robot. Very sharp shape. I don't know if I want to keep it that sharp. There's no other shapes that are quite that sharp. I want to mirror this a little bit more. So we're going to blunt that, make that a blunt shape, clean up that edge just a little bit, scribble some of this extra chalky texture away, and get the wrap the chassis around perhaps a bit. I'm not digging it. Feel like it interferes with the believability. All right, so basically what I'm doing is separating these tones and shadows and just reinforcing some of the design choices that I inferred earlier, but now have the step to start clarifying. Just trying to turn the forms and really simplify some of the silhouette. These shapes aren't doing a ton of favors, so I'm going to kind of run back and forth between some value structure. Again, just simplifying. This dark edge doesn't really have a purpose. It reads more like a line than a separation of shape. Line and shape are important distinctions to make. There's not a lot of lines in nature, if any. They don't really exist. They're kind of abstractions we use as artists to understand things better. So when you're converting something from a line into a painting, it can be sort of a touch and go thing. Feels weird that his other shoulder's not implemented. Then we also got to finish up this female figure somehow and motivate her pose. What I might do is make a time lapse of that for the next video and then go into color, and also reinforcing the lighting scenario, because by this point we've talked enough about drawing and value separation and lighting. I think that you have an idea of how this process moves forward and the time it can take when you're going from something fairly sketchy to something that has more of a finish, even though this is still pretty sketchy. So I think that this is getting to be a pretty good point where we will have to go into time-lapse mode for the next video, and then I'll talk a little bit about color and add some finishing touches for the next video. So there's still a lot to solve with what I've set up, and I think that's the best way to approach it. So thank you for watching. This is Taylor Payton of Pt.2 and PowerPainters.org, And again, if you are interested in acquiring any of those courses where I go more in depth and have an 8-week lesson plan for the drawing course and the painting course, then that is in the description box below. It really helps support power painters, and you can level up your stuff with some more succinct and wholesome information. I love to make videos like this, but there's just never enough time. And if you don't actually set aside time to watch stuff, you tend to not take in the information as deeply. So that's why I always take courses myself and buy tutorials, because then I feel more motivated to set aside the time to watch it and create art based on what I saw, and that helps me to further cement what they're actually teaching. So yeah, thanks for watching, and we will continue this in the drawing process part 3 on Thursday of this week. So I'll see you then. Happy creating.